The families of British soldiers killed in the Iraq War have abandoned their legal battle to have former Prime Minister Tony Blair and other government officials tried for war crimes. They'd been advised by lawyers that courts wouldn't be able to rule on the case. Almost 15 years have passed since the invasion of Iraq. Around 500,000 people in total were killed. Among them were 179 British soldiers. Well, the official British inquiry into the war, known as the Chilcot report, was published last year. It blasted the government for rushing into the conflict based on flawed intelligence. RT's Polly Boyko met one man who lost his brother in the war.
On numerous occasions, I've been mistaken. They were like white as a ghost. They thought they'd seen a ghost. Someone's added me on Facebook not so long back and thought I was David.
Mike Wilson lost his identical twin brother, Lance Corporal David Wilson, in Iraq in 2008. David was 27. He'd become a father to his daughter Poppy weeks before his death.
People say that twins have a twin bond kind of thing. And I never really believe in this kind of thing. I'm quite pragmatic. But you realise that something is switched off.
Together with other families of the soldiers fallen in Iraq, Mike pushed for a civil case against Tony Blair. But lawyers have told them that British courts can't make judgments on matters of foreign policy, military decisions, or the legality of war. For the grieving relatives, the legal route here in the UK has been exhausted.
For them, the loss of a loved one in a conflict that the Chilcot report concluded was based on flawed intelligence will never be forgotten. The damning report revealed that Saddam Hussein presented no immediate threat and that politicians spoke of weapons of mass destruction with a certainty that wasn't justified.
Fortunately, Tony Blair has been made immune from prosecution in the High Court. It seems that pretty much they can do what they want and get away with it.
Where does that leave the families?
It has destroyed some of the families, to this day. Some of them haven't recovered. A lot of them still, relive what went through, from the day that they got that knock at the door. It seems a bit pointless now that, we were told they had weapons of mass destruction. Then we found out that they didn't, and then when the Chilcot inquiry came out of the blue, we got the outcome. It was kind of like, well, what was all this for, and all for me, 9 years down the line, there's no closure at all. It just all seems very, very pointless.
With all the legal avenues closed off, the Iraq War Families Campaign Group is launching a petition demanding that Parliament holds the politicians responsible for the war to account.
Tony Blair at the end of the day, the decision was his, and he was in full fact and full knowledge of all the facts, that circumstances surrounding Iraq, and the reasons why we went in. He'll have been privy to all of the information. So, yeah, I do hold him personally responsible.
The petition is Mike's initiative, his way of continuing the fight, even after losing the possibility of a legal battle. For politicians and newsrooms, the Iraq War may have been pushed into the archives, but for families like Mike's, the wounds of losing their loved ones are as raw as ever.
Hearing, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has just held a news conference with his UK counterpart Boris Johnson. Johnson's in Moscow for the first time in 5 years, with relations at an historic low. Let's cross the line now to RT's Ilya Pachenko, who has been following all those proceedings. Hi there, Ilya. Well, as we were anticipating, that was some news conference. Talk us through the highlights.
Yeah, Kate, that was some news conference. You're absolutely right. And I guess for a very long while, we haven't seen so many jokes, so many ways to poke each other during the press conference. So let's go through the key things. First, of course, there were the formal, they were trying to list the things that both foreign ministers, both top diplomats talked about. But then as the questions started coming in, the issue of allegations of Russian meddling in the elections worldwide and specifically in the UK, and also the EU referendum came up. Boris Johnson once famously said that he hadn't seen any evidence of Russian involvement. The specific words he used were "not a sausage. And this time, when the issue came up, Boris Johnson slightly changed his opinion. He said that, in fact, there was no evidence of successful interference. So I asked him to elaborate on that a little bit and make his point clear. And this is what Boris Johnson said.
There was, alas, I'm afraid, abundant evidence of Russian interference in elections in Germany, in Denmark, in France, in America. But as I say, there is no evidence of any successful Russian interference in the UK.
As I've said, this was a great, exciting press conference, and one of the reasons for this was that you could really see the two officials listening to each other, and if you look at their facial expressions, that is something that's completely different from the usual press conference. And when Sergei Lavrov heard the words of Boris Johnson that we were just listening to, they really started a conversation right in between. You could see that they had different opinions on it, and they were absolutely open about it. So take a listen to that bit, and let's look at that moment.
Доказательств, что Россия вмешивалась в референдум по выходу Британии из Евросоюза.
UK referendum.
Not successfully, I think is the word. Not successfully is the word.
Он боится, что теперь, если он
You see, he's afraid that if he doesn't contradict me, then when he gets back to the UK, his reputation is going to be ruined in the media.
Sergei, it's your reputation I'm worried about.
Я беспокоюсь о вашей репутации.
I think it's very, very important that
Я считаю,
you should recognize
очень важно,
Russian attempts
чтобы вы
interfere
признали,
in our elections and our referendums, whatever they may have not been successful. So you can reassure yourself on that point, and that's an important consideration, because I think had it been successful, that would have been an entirely different matter.
Отсутствие действий никогда не может привести к результату.
The absence of action can never result in anything.
По-прежнему факты.
I agree with you, but we still would like to get some concrete facts.
Вмешивались, но безуспешно.
Supporting our unsuccessful meddling without facts, it is very hard to have a serious discussion. I think you've just made all this up in your Western company, and unfortunately right now you are sort of hostage to this subject. It is very hard to get down from the fence you've climbed.
Well, Kate, let's move on to the other highlights, because there were still plenty, including Boris Johnson calling himself a committed Russophile, saying a few words in Russian, also showing an FSB, which is the Russian Federal Security Service, notepad that he got from one of the Russian FSB officials during the conversations. Besides this, Boris Johnson admitted and confirmed that while he was in Tehran a couple of weeks ago, he secretly went to the Russian embassy to see where the famous Tehran conference during the Second World War happened. And this is something that completely came out of the dark for the British journalists that were there. As we also remember, ahead of this visit, one of the UK MPs published guidelines. It was an open letter in the Times for Boris Johnson. It was more like a survival guide, not the things that Boris Johnson shouldn't do in Moscow. And one of the Russian journalists asked Boris Johnson about it. There were things about challenging drinking games, things like receiving phone calls during the night not to make him sleep. So let's see what the UK top diplomat had to say about that.
No, I want you to know it's a measure of my trust that as soon as I got into this excellent foreign minister, I immediately handed my coat, my hat, my gloves, and indeed everything that was in my pocket, secret or otherwise, to Sergei Lavrov, in the knowledge that he would look after it and it would come to no harm.
Hello there, Ken. Thank you for joining us. I mean, what do you make of these talks? I mean, Boris has said a lot of negative things about Russia recently. I mean, do you think the tone's improved today?
Well, while he's there, he'll try and be a bit pleasant and nice, but it's not just the things Boris has said. I mean, Theresa May has made a whole series of unremitting and unrelenting attacks on Russia. And I think to understand what's happened here, it was kept very suppressed, but back in Obama's administration, he tried to put together a coalition against China. He tried to, Japan, South Korea, he wanted Russia, he wanted India in, because America is frightened about China's growing economy. And President Putin wouldn't do that. It's important that Russia trades with China. It has this vast border. And ever since Putin refused to get behind this sort of anti-China alliance, there's been these unremitting attacks about how they're supposed to be interfering over the internet in our elections and in our votes, all of which are being challenged by academics studying the data.
Well, Boris, he also called himself a Russophile. What do you think of that?
Basically, having known Boris for a very long time and fought 2 elections against him, I never believe a word he says. He says whatever he thinks will go down well at the time. And his other big weakness is he's usually not read all the briefing documents his civil servants have provided him, which is why he makes sometimes catastrophic mistakes, as he did about the woman detained in Tehran, saying she'd been training journalists when she hadn't. So basically, Boris isn't even really a politician. He wants to be a celebrity. He doesn't have a great strategy or anything, so it will just be responding to events as they come. And when he gets back in London, he'll most probably do a wide-ranging denunciation of President Putin's government.
Well, let's go back to this press conference, entertaining though it was as well, and also revealing some of the language that he used. He said there's abundant evidence of Russian interference in elections worldwide, while Sergei Lavrov said the allegation was a Western campaign. This is old rhetoric, isn't it? Why do you think this is still going?
Well, I was in Russia in 1996 when you had Yeltsin up for re-election as president. And that election was totally rigged, and I suspect there was a considerable degree of American interference in that, because Zyuganov, who was the Communist Party candidate, most probably really won by about 54 to 46, but all of that was suppressed. And Yeltsin, who by that stage was completely dysfunctional, carried on. I think that's why when Putin came to power and really started to rejig the government and set a real agenda, people felt such a sense of relief.
Well, the final question is that we've reached this point where it's an all-time low between the relations between the UK and Russia. Do you think any breakthrough has been made already or will be made during this initial conversation that we're having between Sergei Lavrov and Boris Johnson?
I think that unless Russia starts taking an anti-China stance, you'll continue to see attacks from America and its allies like Britain on Russia. And that, America's establishment cannot accept the fact that China's economy is about to overtake America. And within the bureaucracy, the State Department, they're still debating how can America remain the global superpower. Well, that
unilateral decision to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Only 9 member states, including the US, vetoed, or should I say voted against the resolution, while 128 others believe the city's status can only be resolved through talks. Well, prior to the vote, the US had threatened to take the names of those supporting the resolution.
When we make a decision about where to locate our embassy, we don't expect those we've helped to target us. On Thursday, there'll be a vote criticising our choice. The US will be taking names.
We express our regret over the fact that the United States of America exercised a veto.
The recent decision of our UN member states to recognize Jerusalem or Al-Quds as the capital of Israel violates the international law.
States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation. We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations. America will put our embassy in Jerusalem. No vote in the United Nations will make any difference on that.
Now, a number of countries that don't normally see eye to eye on international issues came together. Saudi Arabia and Iran, regional rivals, voted together to condemn the United States and Israel. Furthermore, we saw North Korea and South Korea, two other countries that don't tend to get along,